The boss of one of the country's biggest outlaw motorcycle clubs is now in custody after he allegedly failed to stick to conditions placed on him by police.
Meet Allan Meehan, the man who once ruled Sydney's criminal underworld with an iron fist. As the head of the infamous Comanchero bikee gang, Meehan lived a life of luxury, flaunting everything from flashy cars to $25,000 love boats on Sydney Harbour. But behind the high-end lifestyle was a trail of violence, criminal plots, and a history of bloody power struggles. From taking charge after the brutal killing of his predecessor to facing multiple serious charges, Meehan's story is a roller coaster ride of rise and fall. But how did this so-called kingpin end up behind bars? Stick around, because we're diving deep into the shocking downfall of Allan Meehan. Allan Meehan wasn't always the face of the Comanchero gang. Before he became the notorious leader, his life was relatively quiet. But like many others who rise to power in the underworld, his story is built on ambition, grit, and a fair amount of violence. Born in Sydney, Meehan was no stranger to tough surroundings. The city's rough streets shaped him, but it wasn't until he got involved with the Comancheros that his life would take a sharp turn. Meehan started out in the gang in the early 2000s, working his way up through the ranks. He wasn't just a run-of-the-mill member. Meehan had the drive and mentality to make a name for himself. He was ambitious, fearless, and willing to do whatever it took to prove he was tough enough. That meant getting involved in some serious criminal activities, and it didn't take long before he started gaining respect from his fellow gang members. The Comancheros themselves are known for their violent reputation and their connections to organized crime. With their fists, firearms, and drug operations, they've made quite a name for themselves in Australia and beyond. Meehan didn't just want to be part of the action. He wanted to control it. His rise was fast. As the years went on, he started taking on more and more responsibility. By the time he was in his late 30s, he was already a top figure in the gang, heavily involved in all the big dealings, from drugs to extortion and more. His rise was marked by calculated moves and a ruthless streak that would later define his leadership. But it wasn't just about crime for Meehan. As he became more powerful, he embraced the perks that came with it. Meehan developed a taste for the lavish lifestyle. While most gang leaders might stay under the radar, he had no problem showing off his success. His flashy cars, luxury boats, and expensive tastes became a part of his public image. One of the most talked about splurges was his purchase of a $25,000 luxury boat, which he docked on the famous Sydney Harbour. That boat wasn't just a sign of wealth, it was a statement. Meehan wasn't just running the streets, he was living like a king. Despite the glamorous life, Meehan's world was far from safe. Gang life is unpredictable, and with power comes danger. In 2019, Meehan's rise coincided with the murder of former Comanchero leader Mark Buddle, which set off a bloody power struggle within the gang. It wasn't long before Allan Meehan took control. He'd proven his loyalty, ambition, and capacity for violence, which meant he was ready to take the reins. The gang was in chaos, but Meehan's confidence and ruthless efficiency helped restore order, at least for a while. This wasn't just about gang turf wars or drug money. Meehan was now a key player in the underworld. The Comancheros had a reputation for running illegal operations with an iron fist, and Meehan's leadership wasn't going to change that. Under his watch, the gang made headlines for more than just being a threat to rival gangs. They became a force to be reckoned with on an international scale. Meehan wasn't afraid to flaunt the success of his organization. But the more power he gained, the bigger the targets on his back became. Little did Meehan know that his rapid rise to power would eventually set the stage for his stunning downfall. As his criminal empire grew, so did the attention of law enforcement. As Allan Meehan's name grew more infamous, the attention on him became impossible to ignore. What once started as a relatively discreet criminal operation turned into a full-blown headline-making story. The Comanchero gang wasn't just a local nuisance anymore. They were making waves internationally, and with that came a whole new level of heat from law enforcement. Meehan wasn't just a figurehead in the criminal world, he was hands-on. From running drug trafficking operations to overseeing violent turf wars, he had a finger in every pie. And while his wealth was growing by the day, it wasn't without its consequences. With power came enemies, not only from rival gangs, but from the law too. The more Meehan flaunted his wealth, the more law enforcement kept a keen eye on him. They started building a case, knowing he was at the heart of it all. One of the first major blows to Meehan's reign came in 2020. The police, after years of gathering intel and monitoring his every move, finally caught a break. Meehan was linked to the murder of former Comanchero boss Mark Buttle's alleged associates, which was tied to a series of violent clashes with other gangs. But despite his known involvement in these violent episodes, Meehan managed to keep his hands clean in the public eye, at least for a while. Even though Meehan stayed under the radar, things began to spiral. The Comancheros were not just making money from drugs and violence. They were expanding their criminal enterprises, pulling in new members, and growing in influence. But Meehan wasn't just about running a successful operation. He was out there showing the world what he had. Luxury cars, high-end designer clothes, and expensive property were just some of the things that kept Meehan in the spotlight. What seemed like the ultimate flex soon turned into his biggest vulnerability. Meehan's flashy lifestyle caught the attention of the public and the press, and it wasn't long before people started piecing things together. His social media accounts, loaded with pictures of him enjoying his lavish life, gave the authorities even more fuel to work with. As the man at the top of the Comanchero gang, he became the perfect target. What was once a cool display of power and success quickly turned into a glaring beacon for the police. Meehan might have thought he was untouchable, but the law had been closing in, and they were ready to make their move. One of the most significant events that ramped up the pressure on Meehan was the Australian Federal Police, AFP, bringing a serious case against him. He was allegedly involved in numerous illegal operations, including the trafficking of drugs, firearms, and money laundering. On top of this, law enforcement was tying him to a deadly violent crime wave, one that left several people dead. The more the police dug, the more they uncovered about the inner workings of the Comancheros and Meehan's role in it all. But here's where things got really messy. Just when Meehan thought he might be able to outsmart the system like he had done before, the walls began to close in. The authorities weren't just focusing on his past, they were tracking his every move, his every connection, and his every purchase. The noose was tightening, and it was clear that Meehan's days of living the high life were numbered. But what would finally lead to his arrest? After years of carefully navigating the dangers of gang life and running his empire with an iron fist, Allan Meehan's world started to unravel. It's one thing to stay under the radar when you're at the top of a criminal operation, but once the authorities start piecing everything together, it becomes nearly impossible to avoid the fallout. Meehan's downfall didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn that started with growing tensions within the Comancheros and outside pressures mounting from law enforcement. One of the key moments in Meehan's downfall came in 2021, when he found himself at the center of a new police operation. The Australian Federal Police were already investigating his ties to multiple violent incidents, drug trafficking, and money laundering, but now they were digging even deeper. The investigation had started focusing on the Comancheros as a whole, and more specifically on the role Meehan played in expanding their criminal activities. But it wasn't just about the crimes anymore. His lifestyle, his relationships, and his actions were now under a microscope. Meehan, the once untouchable kingpin, had a target on his back. With a criminal enterprise that had grown larger and more violent over time, his every move was being tracked. And Meehan wasn't exactly helping himself. As the pressure mounted, he grew more reckless, continuing to flaunt his success even as the heat on him grew stronger. His $25,000 boat purchase? That wasn't just a luxury. It was a sign of arrogance. Meehan knew the attention it would grab, and he didn't care. But it only added fuel to the fire, showing that he was either confident he could escape the law or simply too cocky to care. But what really started to turn the tide against him was the increasing power struggles within the gang itself. The Comancheros were infamous for their internal conflicts, and as Meehan's rule grew more brutal, other members of the gang started to get restless. Meehan wasn't just dealing with the constant pressure from the authorities. Now, he had to worry about maintaining control over his own crew. Tensions started rising, and what was once a tight-knit operation began to splinter. Meehan had come into power after the violent murder of the previous leader, Mark Buttle, and although he had secured his place, not all of the Comanchero members were happy with how he was running things. As his leadership grew more aggressive, It began to alienate some of the more moderate members, and with that came whispers of betrayal. The cracks in the foundation of Meehan's empire were starting to show, and the authorities were ready to take advantage. The pressure of internal conflict, combined with the looming threat of arrest, caused Meehan to act out of desperation. He started making moves that were risky, even for someone as seasoned as him. The police were catching on to his every move, and despite his reputation for staying a step ahead, Meehan knew his days were numbered. In early 2022, the walls were closing in faster than he could keep up with. He was connected to a long list of crimes, but now the authorities had a clearer picture of his role in the violent criminal activities happening around Sydney. The tipping point came when law enforcement gathered enough evidence to bring serious charges against him, charges that could result in years, maybe even decades, behind bars. Meehan wasn't ready to go down without a fight, but it was becoming clear that no amount of money or influence could save him from what was coming. Meehan tried to lay low, but it was too late. His actions had attracted too much attention, and the authorities weren't letting up. He'd lived his life in the fast lane, and now the inevitable crash was coming. The day Allan Meehan was finally arrested wasn't just a blow to him personally. It was a blow to the entire Comanchero gang. Meehan had built his reputation on being untouchable, on keeping one step ahead of the law. But no amount of bravado or luxury boats could save him this time. In 2023, Meehan's arrest marked the end of an era for the Comancheros, and it wasn't just a simple bust. It was a culmination of years of investigation, surveillance, and mounting pressure. The arrest itself was dramatic. It wasn't as if Meehan had been taken down in some low-key, quiet raid. The police knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they made sure they had everything in place before they moved in. Armed with a solid case built over years of intelligence gathering, the Australian Federal Police, AFP, struck fast. Meehan, who had always been quick to escape the law, couldn't dodge this one. He was nabbed in a dramatic operation that involved not just local police, but federal forces as well. News of the arrest spread quickly. Sydney, known for its gritty criminal underworld, had seen its fair share of gang takedowns. But Meehan's was different. This wasn't just any biker boss. This was the leader of one of the most powerful gangs in Australia, and his arrest was a clear message to everyone involved in organized crime. It wasn't just a victory for the law. It was a reminder that even the most untouchable criminals eventually get caught. For the Comancheros, Meehan's arrest sent shockwaves through the ranks. His leadership, which had kept the gang together through numerous violent clashes and rivalries, was now gone. The power vacuum left in his absence quickly became evident. Without Meehan's ruthless control, internal conflicts and rivalries within the gang started to surface more aggressively. The Comancheros were a fractured organization, and the loss of their leader made them vulnerable in ways they hadn't been before. But even as he was carted off to jail, Meehan was still a figurehead in the gang's operations. His influence didn't disappear overnight. His arrest did little to stop the Comancheros from continuing their illegal activities. Instead, the gang's operations were temporarily taken over by key lieutenants. But without Meehan's strong grip on the organization, the Comancheros began to lose their hold on the streets. Meehan's downfall didn't just affect the Comancheros. It was a massive blow to the wider criminal landscape in Australia. As one of the most high-profile bikey bosses to be arrested in recent years, it sparked renewed efforts by law enforcement to crack down on organized crime. His arrest was part of a larger strategy to dismantle the power of outlaw motorcycle gangs in Australia, many of which, like the Comancheros, have long been involved in illegal drug trade, extortion, and violence. The legal consequences for Meehan were serious. He was facing a mountain of charges, from his involvement in violent crimes to his links to large-scale drug trafficking operations. The list of accusations against him was long, and there was no way around it. The evidence against him was undeniable. As the investigation continued, Meehan was linked to a number of high-profile criminal activities, including the murder of rival gang members and his role in a series of violent clashes between bikee gang. The charges were as serious as they came, and the case against him was strong. The authorities weren't just targeting him for the crimes he committed under his leadership. They were determined to make an example of him, hoping his fall would serve as a warning to others in the criminal world. After his arrest, Allan Meehan's life as a powerful bikey boss came crashing down, but the aftershocks of his downfall were felt far beyond the courtroom. For someone who had commanded so much respect, or fear within the criminal underworld, Meehan's arrest was a bitter reminder that even the most seemingly untouchable criminals eventually meet their end. As Meehan was taken away to face the charges against him, his empire didn't just disappear overnight. The Comancheros were still active, still operating in the shadows, but the loss of their leader left them fractured and vulnerable. In the immediate aftermath, the gang was thrown into disarray. Without Meehan's firm hand to keep things in check, rival factions within the gang began to fight for control. This power vacuum didn't just destabilize the Comancheros, it sent ripples through Sydney's criminal scene as a whole. The Comancheros' operations weren't as clean-cut without Meehan at the helm. The underworld thrives on control, and Meehan had been a master at making sure the gang had its hands in everything from drug trafficking to arms dealing. But with him gone, members scrambled to fill the void, creating infighting and weakening the organization. It wasn't long before other gangs began picking off the Comancheros' territory and dealing with what was left of their operations. Without a strong leader, the Comancheros were no longer the feared powerhouse they once were. But Meehan's arrest didn't just impact the Comancheros. His downfall was a major blow to the wider criminal network in Australia. The authorities were hungry for more arrests. The focus on bikie gang intensified, with law enforcement making it clear that they were ready to dismantle the entire organization piece by piece. As the police moved in on other members of the gang, the Comancheros began to lose their grip on power, at least temporarily. The entire chapter of Meehan's rule highlighted the vulnerability that even the most dangerous gangs had. Power, it turned out, could only last for so long. What was once a well-oiled criminal machine was now in disarray, and it wasn't long before more arrests followed. Meehan's closest associates were caught up in the dragnet, and many were either thrown behind bars or forced to lay low as the police closed in. But even in his absence, Meehan's influence was still felt. His name still carried weight within the gang. For a while, it was clear that the Comancheros, despite their fractured state, would never truly be rid of the shadow of their former leader. Meehan's arrest also left a lasting impact on the public perception of bikie gang in Australia. His name became synonymous with organized crime, and it added fuel to the ongoing war against outlaw motorcycle gangs in the country. The media had a field day with his arrest, as they do with any high-profile criminal. But it also gave law enforcement the spotlight they'd been working toward. Meehan had become the face of what they were trying to eradicate, a violent, drug-running, extortion-driven gang that had far too much control in the streets. But even though Meehan's arrest marked the end of his reign, the damage was done. His leadership left behind a legacy of violence, power struggles, and a criminal empire that had once been untouchable. The ripple effect of his downfall continued to shake the foundations of Sydney's underworld, and other gangs began taking advantage of the Comancheros' weakness. Meehan's empire might have crumbled, but the chaos that followed his arrest showed just how deep the roots of organized crime ran. As Allan Meehan sits behind bars, his legacy is a complicated one. On the surface, his rise to power in the Comanchero gang may seem like a story of success, wealth, influence, and fear. But as we know, all empires eventually crumble, and Meehan's was no different. His criminal career, built on violence, control, and constant battles, ultimately led him to the place he'd spent years trying to avoid: prison. For all the power Meehan wielded as leader of the Comancheros, he couldn't escape the law forever. His downfall was a result of both his arrogance and his rise to prominence. Meehan lived his life as though he was invincible, flaunting his wealth, his luxurious lifestyle, and his dominance over the criminal world. But while that may have made him untouchable in the short term, it also made him an easy target for law enforcement. His ostentatious displays of power and success were the very things that drew the attention of the authorities. The more he flaunted his wealth, the more they took notice. And, in the end, it was that very arrogance that played a key role in his arrest. Meehan's story isn't just a tale of a man who rose to the top of a criminal gang. It's also a cautionary tale about the price of power. Meehan's desire for control and success came at a great cost, not just to his own freedom, but to the lives of those around him. Under his reign, the Comancheros became notorious for their involvement in violent acts and illegal operations. And in the end, that violence didn't just affect his rivals. It affected everyone who crossed his path, from innocent bystanders to his own gang members who were left to pick up the pieces. Despite his fall from grace, Allan Meehan's influence is still felt today. His name is now forever tied to the Comancheros and the dark side of Sydney's underworld. But his arrest also served as a stark reminder to other criminals that no one is untouchable. The authorities, while often outnumbered and outgunned by groups like the Comancheros, are persistent. They've shown time and time again that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Meehan's story might be over for now, but it's a chapter in Australia's criminal history that won't soon be forgotten. So, where does that leave the Comancheros now? Without Meehan at the helm, the gang is still trying to recover from the loss of their powerful leader. But it's clear that without a strong central figure like Meehan, they've become just another fragmented criminal operation. And the message is clear. Even the most dangerous and well-organized criminal gangs can be taken down, one arrest at a time. In the end, Allan Meehan's arrest was more than just the fall of one man. It was the fall of a dynasty. His story is a testament to the dangers of living a life built on crime, power, and violence. No matter how high you rise, the law is always waiting for you to come down.